Well, good afternoon, everybody here in the sanctuary, and to those of you watching remotely. I'm Philip Barnes, Artistic Director of the St Louis Chamber Chorus, and here we are at the fifth of our presentations in this pandemic season, and this is a presentation that I have been looking forward to eagerly, as I know many of you have been, because we have a distinguished and wonderful guest for this program, and it's my old friend and former chamber chorus singer, Esley Hamilton, the former county parks historian and preservation historian. And I like to say that I am so old that I knew most of the composers whose music we perform. And Esley's just a little younger than I am, so he knew all the architects.
Yeah, right.
So we'll find some very interesting observations about these to begin our program. What we're going to do to begin with is to show you, or to demonstrate to you, an exercise in extremes. And it's on our program. You can see this. What I thought it would be interesting to do in this program would be to talk about this selection of repertoire and how that is guided often by the tradition or the ethnicity of the venue, but of course also by the architecture and the acoustic. Well, speaking of acoustic, the first piece you're going to hear has basically no acoustic because it was performed outdoors. It is a piece of music that Felix Mendelssohn specifically wrote to be sung outdoors, and we perform it at the new Mount Sinai Cemetery in South St. Louis. And after that, you're going to hear the other extreme, and that is probably St. Louis's longest and most luxurious acoustic, huge echo, at the St. Louis Cathedral-Basilica. Tell us a little about those two venues.
Well, the new Mount Sinai Cemetery is the oldest active Jewish cemetery in the St. Louis area, going back to 1850. It was originally just 1 acre. It's now 86 acres, and it was reorganized by 3 Jewish Reform congregations in 1888 as New Mount Sinai Cemetery. There is no old Mount Sinai Cemetery, which took me a long time to figure out. And it has many family mausolea by many prominent St. Louis architects, and also the number of familiar names of people who have made great contributions to St. Louis there is really remarkable. And it's very much worth visiting at any time just to see how many prominent philanthropists and businessmen are buried there. The mausoleum where the chorus sang was built in 1969, and it was all marble on the inside, so you really had to be careful with the repertoire. So singing it outdoors was probably a good idea. The new cathedral is also a strange name. It's called new, even though it's been in use since 1914. The old cathedral, though, goes back more than almost a century beyond that to 1834. But that building, which is now on the grounds of the Arch, was recognized as being too crowded by businesses, too smoky and dirty, and not where the parishioners were living as early as right after the Civil War. And there was a lot of pressure to build a new cathedral up until the new parish was founded in 1896. Then the cornerstone was laid by Archbishop Glennon, who was just new to St. Louis at that point. They started worshiping in 1914, but the interior really wasn't finished until 1986. It was designed by Barnett, Haynes, and Barnett, who were the sons and son-in-law of the most prominent 19th century architect in St. Louis, George I. Barnett, and they won a competition. It is Romanesque on the outside, but on the inside, it's Byzantine, very closely modeled on the Basilica of San Marco in Venice. The interior elevations with the marble below and the glass mosaics above are almost identical to San Marco. And of course, that explains a part of the reason for the long echo. The other reason is that it has 3 domes, not just one. over the nave, the crossing, and the chancel. Many different artists worked on the mosaics, but they were mainly created by one company, Ravenna Mosaic, which was a side company that Emil Frey Studios, the stained glass company, founded, and they're still in existence today. But there were at least two other companies worked on the cathedral in the chapels. Each of the four side chapels is really a work of art in its own right, and two of those were designed by Tiffany Company and one by Gorham, both of which are more famous for their jewelry and silver than for their liturgical work today.
And this, of course, explains why when we were at the Cathedral-Basilica, I chose largely Venetian music, because I figured if it worked in San Marco, Venice, it would work here. So you're going to hear a huge, massive piece by Gabrieli, Giovanni Gabrieli, that was written for San Marco around the turn of the 17th century. But before that, you hear this outdoors performance of Resting Place. Seems an appropriate piece for a cemetery. Resting Place by Felix Mendelssohn. So two rather different acoustics, I think you'll agree. And of course, acoustics are very important in the selection of repertoire and in how we gauge and direct our performances. But sometimes there are other issues that sort of drive the agenda. And not far from the new cathedral, we have a building that is, if you like, a temple to a different sort of god, and that, of course, is the Schlafly Brewery. And you will not be surprised to learn that there's quite a lot of repertoire written for drinking and certainly for beer. And in that building, we performed a piece just for the men's voices, and I'll come back to that later on. It's an idea of whether, if the whole choir can't sing in the building, sometimes we have just the women singing it or just the men singing in it. And sometimes that actually shows off a limited space to the greatest advantage. So we have a piece by Vaughan Williams that seemed to be a sort of rollicking drinking song with a rather deadly sense of humor, I suppose, Down Among the Dead Men. And I've paired that with some haunting photographs that I have that I've taken of the portraits that are put on mummies in the Romano-Egyptian tradition from a site called Fayum. So there are the haunting faces of these people from 2,000 years ago looking back at you as you hear the men of the choir singing, Down Among the Dead Men, Let Me Lie. And after that, very, very close again to the Cathedral-Basilica and to the Schlafly Taproom, we have a particular favorite acoustic of ours and setting, and that's Second Presbyterian Church. We like this building so much for the way we sound in it that our most recent compact discs have actually all been made there. And this despite the fact that it's on a prominent bus route. So we have to time our takes according to the traffic outside. But it is a really wonderful building because we sound warm in there, but there's also great clarity. And clarity is sometimes something you lose in an acoustic like the Cathedral-Basilica. So what I thought I'd do now is to hear these two pieces, but ask Esley just to tell us a little about the two very different styles of architecture of the taproom and then also of Second Presbyterian.
Okay, well, the taproom was originally built as a publishing company by a firm called Lambert, Deacon and Hill, and Lambert was one of the partners in Lambert Pharmaceutical, which made Listerine, and their headquarters were right across the street from here, so he could keep his eye on both businesses at once. The architect was a man named Samuel Schurer, who was kind of a gentleman architect. He only took certain projects, and he really showed his expertise in the English Renaissance style here with the wonderful brickwork decorating the roof line and the front facing Locust Street. Actually, it's one of my favorite buildings to show off St. Louis's bricklaying. The building was completely gutted by fire in 1976. And speaking of how old we were, I was there and saw that fire.
You didn't.
I didn't start it, no. It was, and the building remained empty for about 15 years. All the while, everybody was worrying about the future of this St. Louis treasure. And finally, Tom Schlafly and Dan Kopman of Schlafly Brewery took on the restoration of that with Tom Cohen as the architect. Second Presbyterian Church had been located on 17th Street at Locust when they moved to Taylor, which was 45th Street, which is a good indication of how far west the fashionable neighborhoods of St. Louis were moving during that time. In 1896, the Boston firm of Shepley, Rutan, and Coolidge built the education wing, but they turned in 1899 to a local architect to complete the main sanctuary, Theodore Link, who was actually one of the most famous architects in the country at that time because of Union Station. And you can see that the two buildings have a lot of similarities. They're both in what has become known as the Richardsonian Romanesque style, a style that was developed by H.H. Richardson in Boston. And the churches closely modeled after Richardson's Trinity Church in Copley Square, which at that time was considered the most popular building in the United States, believe it or not. The original source of the design is the old cathedral at Salamanca, Spain. The church is also known for its windows because it has an outstanding collection of windows by the Tiffany Company, some of them signed by Tiffany, Louis Comfort Tiffany. The inside has been remodeled a few times, but just recently, a very sensitive renovation was done that has brightened the interior and brought the colors of the walls very close to the way it originally was. And you can see the green background of those walls closely ties in with the green and blue color harmonies of the windows.
So we're going to hear now from these two rather wonderful monumental buildings from really the end of the 19th century in many ways. Mm-hmm. We're going to hear two pieces of music written by two very good friends. And they're both folk songs from England, the first one by Ralph Vaughan Williams, and the second one from way up towards the Scottish border. We're going to hear a very quick, wonderful little folk song called Bobby Shaftoe, arranged by Vaughan Williams's friend William Gillies Whittaker.
Here's a health to the king and a lasting peace, to faction and end to wealth increase. Come, let us drink it while we have breath, for there is no drinking after death. And he who will this health deny, down, 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 down among the dead men, let him lie. Let charming beauty's health go round, in whom celestial joys are found, and may confusion still pursue the senseless woman-hating crew, and they that woman's health deny, down, 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 down among the dead men, let him lie. In smiling Bacchus' joys I'll roll, deny no pleasure to my soul. Let Bacchus' health round briskly move, for Bacchus is a friend to love, and he that will this health deny, down, 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 down among the dead men, let him lie. Make love and might their ranks maintain, and their united pleasures reign, while Bacchus trenchant frowns the whole, will sing the joys that both afford, and he that won't with us comply, down, 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 down among the dead men, let him lie. Bobby Shaftoe's bright and fair, coming down his yellow Bobby Shaftoe's come to see. Silver buckles on his knees. He'll come back and wear his knee. Bobby Shaftoe. Bobby Shaftoe's bright and fair, coming down his yellow hair. He's waiting for caravan. Bobby Shaftoe. Bobby Shaftoe's come to see. Silver buckles on his knee. He'll come back and wear his knee. Hurrah!
Our next group of three pieces were all recorded in buildings here in the Grand Center area, as it's now called. One is at from Third Baptist Church, the building that we're in now, one from the Sheldon Concert Hall just a half a block down the street, and one from the building 2 doors up, Powell Symphony Hall. Grand Boulevard was originally laid out in the 1850s by a real estate developer who thought that because this is high ground, it's a ridge that goes 2/3 of the way around the city, that would be a desirable place for wealthy people to build their houses. And indeed, this was, for a few years, the most fashionable place to live. Many fashionable churches moved here during that period. But by the 20th century, this had also become the place where all of the streetcar and bus lines converged. So it was easy to get here without changing buses or trams from almost any place in the city. And so that attracted businesses and institutions that were serving the wider population. And as you can see from the remaining buildings, that included movie theaters, more churches, almost every fraternal organization was based here, and doctors who had several medical buildings built in this area. Third Baptist Church saw that transition. They were originally built in 1884, and as they said in their charter, they were intended to serve the west part of the city. So this was the west then. The street next door, Washington Avenue, was turned diagonally through the block in 1918 to connect with the section of Washington Avenue west of Grand. St. Louis had no city plan overall, so there were many streets that were disconnected until the street system could be fixed. That made them even more popular, and this was one of the largest Baptist congregations in the city. And then after the interior was burned in 1928, Louis Baylor Pendleton redesigned it as we see it now. And he took advantage of all the stucco and plaster craftsmanship that he was seeing in the new theaters up and down the street to create this spectacular ceiling. In 1951, the present facades and outer rooms were added so that now you can't see the 1884 building anywhere in the building. And the outside was designed really to highlight the fact that this was in a very densely urban area. And it even has an inscription on the side saying, "Where cross the crowded ways of life." The Sheldon Concert Hall was originally built as the Ethical Society of St. Louis, and it was built partly as a memorial to the founder of this particular Ethical Society congregation, Walter Sheldon. The architect for it was Louis Spearing, who had worked in the World's Fair, but he died before the building was finished, age only 38. And a book has recently been written about him called Meeting Louis at the Fair. Because it was designed for speaking primarily as a lecture hall, Spearing consulted with some acoustical engineers, but as the building turned out, it's much better for music than it is for speaking. There's a little bit too much reverberation for speaking. After the Ethical Society moved to their building in Ladue, which we'll talk about later, in 1964, the building went through a variety of uses and people were fearful about its future, but fortunately, it was rescued by a foundation established by Lee Jardine, the chancellor of Webster University, in the 1990s. And an addition was added by Ray Merritt's and also new stained glass windows were added to the building by Rodney Winfield. Powell Symphony Hall also is an adaptive reuse, and actually it's one of the most influential ones from St. Louis. It was originally built as the St. Louis Theater in 1925, and you can see in the stained glass above the main marquee a depiction of St. Louis on his horse. The architects were Rapp and Rapp, and they took the chapel at the Palace of Versailles as their model. And actually the lobby is very closely detailed after Versailles. But the Symphony Society decided to remodel it, and it reopened in 1968 as Powell Symphony Hall. And that actually helped to save other monumental theaters all over the country, because this showed that, that movie theaters could be adapted for other uses. And actually, movie theaters have better sight lines than most concert halls. So,
indeed. So here we are in this little area of St. Louis, which is now thought of as an arts district as much as anything. And what occurred to me in choosing music for these buildings was not just the setting, but also the acoustical properties. So the building we're in at the moment, where Esley and I are sitting, is at the front of basically what's a sound shell. It's a little difficult to see it because of the screen, but there is a shell for the singers back there. And the idea is that if you sing with your body as close to a hard reflective surface as possible, even if it's behind you, you will get some reverberation off that surface. So this is a really wonderful place to sing, and it sort of focuses the sound and makes it go straight down the sanctuary towards everybody at the back. So not surprisingly, the chamber chorus loves to perform here in non-pandemic times, and in fact we will return here for our next season. But also it's the location for one of our compact discs, which was a really wonderful operation for me, because it combined my interest in the classics as well as music. It was a setting, lots of settings of ancient Roman poems, and we made that in this building. As the chamber chorus has developed, and of course choirs have their ups and downs, and they take on a characteristic, probably led by the director, but also by the types of voices that choose to work with the chamber chorus, the sound of the choir has got bigger and bigger and bigger. Those of you who know the choir live will know that for yourself. It's kind of amazing to realize when you hear them that they don't have any amplification. Because of that, you're going to hear next a recording from the Sheldon Concert Hall that we made 23 or 22 years ago. Because more recently, it's not necessarily the right place for us to perform, because we are quite literally too loud for it. So you often hear in St. Louis about the perfection of the acoustics at the Sheldon. Now, part of that's advertising, but also it's true that for a small group, a small musical group, a chamber ensemble, it is a wonderful space. It's great sight lines, and it's a good place to sing and perform music. But for us, if anything, it's become a little too narrow. So let's go from there to another extreme, and a building that we don't obviously normally sing in, which is the Symphony Hall. That's a much bigger building, and what you can hear from actually a rare performance we gave there about 24 years ago, you can hear there that the sound has enough space to echo and have reverberation. Now, reverberation isn't just an echo. It is also overtones, and rather the sound, it comes over to you, the listener, in a sort of warm way or a slightly hard metallic edge way. And so you can hear these things at different play. The acoustic in this building is warmer in many ways, I think, than the Symphony Hall. And I attribute that to two things. First of all, the materials in this building, a lot of wood in this building, as those of you sitting out there can attest, a lot of wood and not as many reflective surfaces, not quite as much plaster. And also the other thing is, of course, the dimensions. So no two buildings are the same. And so my job in finding an appropriate place for the choir to sing is to go and check out these different acoustics and on my own try to work out with various tests whether I think the choir will sound at their best in that space. So I'll leave you to judge. Here are 3 pieces taken from 3 buildings within spitting distance of one another. You'll hear, first of all, a piece by the other great friend of Vaughan Williams, Gustav Holst, a rather lovely song called Autumn. And after that, a stirring piece of jingoism, really, from the Second World War by Benjamin Britten, called Advanced Democracy. You can almost hear the voices wailing like the searchlights, searching the night sky for the enemy bombers. And finally, a very unusual piece, we have performed a fair amount of Brazilian music over the years, and this is a charming piece about the, I think, national bird of Brazil, which is the sabiá, and it's arranged by a very prestigious Brazilian musician called Ailton Escobar. So 3 songs, different styles, different languages, but all within a stone's throw of here in Grand Center.
Sweet are the days now Time
3 songs from the area that we're in at the moment. So let's move from Grand Center a little further east to downtown St. Louis. And we'll hear now 2 different acoustics that really are very, very receptive, I think, very, very accommodating for the human voice singing. First of all, from Christchurch Episcopal Cathedral downtown, which has a particular association with the chamber chorus because our founder, Ronald Arnett, actually came here from Britain to, well, came here anyway, to be the director of the choir there in the 50s. And it was shortly after he came in his early 20s that he founded the St. Louis Chamber Chorus. So for many reasons, that's a building where we love to go back there, we like to say. And so we're going to hear a work that seems appropriate to an Episcopal church. This is a work actually all the way back to the Tudor period in England, and it's by William Mundy, and it's called O Lord, the Maker of All Things. And we're going to compare that piece of religious music from England with a work from the Russian Orthodox tradition. And this time it's from the all-night vigil called Passion Week by Maximilian Steinberg. And that piece we'll hear sung in a building that seems to lend itself so wonderfully to Russian repertoire. And we certainly will be returning there again in the future for performances of Russian choral music. And this is St. Stanislaus Kostka, just north of Christchurch. Tell us a little about these 2, if I may call them iconic buildings, really.
Yes, very much so. Christchurch Cathedral is actually a National Historic Landmark recognized by the National Park Service as being of national significance. It's a great example of mid-19th century Gothic revival, and it's one of the last remaining buildings by Leopold Eidlitz, who was one of the leaders of that movement. But unfortunately, most of his work was in New York City, and it's been torn down over the years. He came here and to design that in 1867. The church had been founded in 1819, farther downtown, and 13th Street was considered a little risky, but it turned out the big risk was the Civil War. Because of that, most of the congregation left town, and they weren't able to fill the building, complete the building until 1867. And I shouldn't really say complete because they just decided to occupy it without actually putting the tower and the narthex on. By the time they added those in 1910, they had realized that they had made a mistake by using sandstone, which didn't react very well to the very sooty environment that we had here in St. Louis at that time. So they completed those things in limestone, and this gives you a contrast today. The interior does have a strongly English look to it because of the reredos, which was also added in 1910 by a sculptor from Exeter, England, Harry Hems, who sent the whole thing parcel post, I think, from England. It's nearly identical to the reredos at St. Albans Cathedral in England, which he was carving at the same time. St. Stanislaus is one of a tradition in St. Louis of ethnic Catholic churches. Our archdiocese here started to have churches that were devoted to a specific ethnic group as early as 1843, whereas most parishes are geographically determined. And now we have a whole range, including Vietnamese and Korean Catholic parishes. This one started in 1880, and the building was built in 1891. Originally, it had a dome on the outside, so it was much more impressive with the 2 towers that remain. But the dome still remains on the inside, and the inside is full of things related to Poland, including the artist who painted the hemicycle painting behind the altar. His name was Jan Stika. The windows, the statues are mostly of Polish saints. also. And the church had a unique relationship to the archdiocese in that it had it was incorporated by the state of Missouri. And after a great deal of litigation a few years ago, they finally decided that that was legal in spite of the fact that it's now contrary to Catholic policy. So St. Stanislaus Kostka, while it observes Catholic ritual, is actually independent of the archdiocese.
I think that that allows us to say that although it's ethnically Polish, we can perform Russian music there.
Yeah.
They clearly have to be flexible.
Right.
So 2 pieces of religious music from very different traditions in Europe and very different periods. Maximilian Steinberg's Alleluia, and before that, O Lord, the Maker of All Things, by William Mundy.
the Soulard neighborhood. The Soulard neighborhood is the oldest intact neighborhood in the city, but it's not as old as people think. The main part of it was closer to the river, and this was actually the suburbs of Soulard laid out in the 1840s. But in the later part of the 19th century, it became the first stop for many different ethnic groups who were migrating to the United States, especially from Eastern Europe. And these buildings reflect that. Trinity Lutheran Church is the mother church of all Missouri Synod Lutheran congregations. It was founded here by a group who migrated in mass from Saxony in 1839. The building on the present site was first built in 1865, but it was completely destroyed by the tornado of 1896, which was one of the worst disasters that has ever occurred in St. Louis. It completely reshaped many of the South Side neighborhoods. The only things that were left were the baptismal font and the pulpit. So they hired a new architect, Charles May, who rebuilt the building in a more modern style with curved seating and sloping floors and eliminating the columns that had been in the older church. The interior was recently restored to its late Victorian appearance, and it still is a major church in this area. St. John Nepomuk, which is just a few blocks to the west, was founded in 1848, and it is also a mother church, the mother church of all Bohemian Catholic parishes in the United States. And that neighborhood was originally a Bohemian ethnic neighborhood called Bohemian Hill, but the reconstruction of the St. Louis Hospital, City Hospital, just in the next block west in 1905, and then the urban renewal and interstate highway programs of the 1950s and 60s pretty much wiped out Bohemian Hill except for St. John's. But it was so important originally that the draft constitution for the new state of Czechoslovakia was drafted there in 1919 and printed in the printing press that the parish operated there. The present building was rebuilt after the tornado of 1896. The front facade still says 1870, but that's the only part of the building that survived. The inside, though, is more traditional, and the columns have statues kind of erected directly on the statues in the style of Cologne Cathedral is the most famous example, and many of them reflect Czech saints. Also, the lower part of the facade has plaques representing the many parish priests who have served that congregation.
So you find that in these two buildings, we have a wonderful place to be in the audience, Trinity Lutheran, because of the absence of pillars. Mm-hmm. And the acoustic is very nice, but St. John Nepomuk, the acoustic is really rich, but you have to contend with pillars. So those are two sort of considerations that we have when we choose repertoire for them. And so the first one, obviously, have such enormous German roots in it, I wanted to perform German music there. So we'll hear a piece of Hugo Distler. And then I wanted to perform a piece that would be appropriate to a Bohemian church. So I chose a piece of somewhat rare Leos Junacek, who was actually a church musician much of his life. So that's why we have the choice of a gradual in that church. But before we get to that, the third in our little group of venues from Soulard is not a church, not even a church to beer, maybe a temple to physical exercise, I'm not sure, but it didn't start off that way. So this is the third building in our collection from Soulard. Tell us a little about that.
The Broadway Athletic Club building was probably built in the 1860s. By the 1880s, it was the home of Stupp Brothers Bridge and Iron Company, and they were there until 1906, and that remains a very important business here in St. Louis. The athletic club started in 1899, and they moved into that building in 1914 and bought it in 1925. I guess after they bought it, they made a rather radical change. On the outside, it looks like a two-story building, but on the inside, they took out the whole second story to make a two-story space that was tall enough for them to erect a boxing rink. And so it was quite a surprise to walk in there for those rehearsals. They also are interested in wrestling, and they are the home of the St. Louis Wrestling Hall of Fame, which is something to look for when it reopens.
And St. Louis is quite a center for wrestling and boxing. Some world champions, of course, like the Spinks brothers, come from St. Louis and had some of their time at that athletic club. Well, you can imagine, perhaps, the facial expressions of the various people who were working in the club and getting it ready for another night's activity when this peculiar Englishman showed up, obviously with a boxer's physique, and said, could I perhaps do a concert here? And they were actually, as you would hope, tremendously gracious, tremendously welcoming, and I would say very patient, as I went around the room trying to see if it could possibly be suited to a performance by the chamber chorus. And you might wonder what on earth set me off on that in the first place. It's because there's a really wonderful piece of American choral music, which I've always wanted to do. I have to find the right building for it. It's by the great American composer Elliott Carter. And he sets some verses by another equally great American artist, Emily Dickinson. And the lines are, musicians wrestle everywhere. So a wrestling arena seemed the obvious place. And you would be amazed / appalled how many pieces of music involve wrestling in them. And it was possible to put together an entire program based on boxing and wrestling to perform in that building. So I will admit that even with the removal of the second floor, the acoustics are not that great for choral music. But this was a case where, be damned the acoustics, we're going to perform in this extraordinary building and just have a good time. And you'll hear the choir in a very, very different style of singing from the Dixie Hummingbirds, and it's called Wrestlin' Jacob. So 3 pieces from Soulard, very different pieces. Hugo Distler from Germany, Leos Janacek from Czechoslovakia, and then finally the Dixie Hummingbirds from the good old US of A. So 3 pieces from the Soulard area. You just heard us performing at the Broadway Athletic Club, and we began with a piece in German, Die Sonne singt von hinnen by Hugo Distler at Trinity Lutheran. And in between, you heard a gradual by Leos Janacek, which we sang at the Bohemian Church of St. John Nepomuk. And we performed that on one of the only remnants of what was in the 19th century Bohemian Hill. Well, Bohemian Hill was not the only hill in a city that, of course, at one point was nicknamed Mound City for all the Native American hills that there were here. The most famous area nowadays in St. Louis called The Hill, not very imaginative, but anyway, The Hill, is the Italian neighborhood. And so in the middle of that neighborhood, there is a very beautiful church to St. Ambrose, and we performed there 6 fire songs setting Renaissance poetry set to music by a modern American composer, Morton Lauridsen. So we're going to hear a piece, an extract from that set, conducted by my colleague Orrin Johnson, one of our 2 great assistant conductors. You heard earlier on the Maximilian Steinberg Alleluia, and that was conducted by our other assistant conductor, Andy Jensen. And after we've enjoyed the Lauridsen, very intense piece, Luci Serene Chiara, we move a little further away to another neighborhood nearby, which we call the Shore neighborhood, and I know that Esley is going to explain to us why it's called the Shore, S-H-A-W, the Shore neighborhood. And there we go to a very beautiful church, again, one that we've used for CD recordings in the past. Our recording called Songs of the Soul was made at St. Margaret of Scotland. It's very beautiful acoustic. And I might add, before I ask Esley to tell us a little about these 2 venues, that for those of you in the sanctuary today, with a program, and those of you at home looking at a program, if you can see one there, we've been able to add for this presentation the number of the season from which the recording was taken. And so you can see that these recordings are taken from over 25 years of our recording our concerts. And it just reminds me to say one thing about not acoustics, but about the actual instrument that is a choir, and that is that in St. Louis we are blessed to have one of America's and the world's great symphony orchestras. But if you'll bear with me for just a second, there's an element to which you could describe their music as 2-dimensional. It only becomes 2-dimensional if you think of ours being 3-dimensional, because what we're doing is adding lyrics to music, which symphony orchestras don't do. And so in doing that, we have all of these different words in different languages from different periods, a period longer than you would hear from a symphony orchestra. Music from the Renaissance and the late medieval period, all the way up to yesterday, and in many languages. At this presentation alone, you're hearing 7 different languages. So it is an enormous tribute, it seems to me, to the singers, to be able to get their heads and their mouths and their tongues and their teeth around all of these different languages and these different styles of singing. And I think it's really worth saying that when you compare the fact that we heard a piece written that would have been familiar to the Tudor court of Elizabeth, O Lord, the maker of all things, and then Wrestlin' Jacob from the Dixie Hummingbirds. I mean, it doesn't get much more different in style than that, and yet these musicians have been able to turn their talents to whatever I tend to inflict upon them. So tell us a little about what I inflicted at St. Ambrose and St. Margaret's.
Well, the great thing about St. Ambrose as an ethnic parish is that the style of the church is a specifically Northern Italian style, the Lombard Romanesque style, which was designed for brick, which is, of course, an appropriate material to St. Louis. And that neighborhood was the result of the brick industry focusing there and actually recruiting Italians to come and work here because they had a lot of experience not only with brick but with terracotta back in Italy. The church was designed in 1925 by an Italian immigrant, Angelo Carubia, and he established a little dynasty of architects. His son was the chief architect for the renovation of Powell Symphony Hall in 1968. And it has a vaulted ceiling in the sanctuary, which affects the acoustics, and also there's plenty of marble on the walls. St. Margaret of Scotland was one of 7 parish churches designed by Barnett, Haynes, and Barnett, the same architectural firm who designed the new cathedral. And there was a connection, more of a connection with Scotland back in the 19th century in St. Louis than there is today. When Henry Shaw died, he actually made a bequest to the St. Andrew's Society, which was a society of Scottish immigrants. And we also have a statue of Robert Burns on the campus of Washington University. And the Ethical Society building on Grand had a room specifically designed for the annual Burns suppers that were held there.
I might tell you all that a dear friend of mine who's passed on now, but was a very distinguished sculptor and professor of sculpture, he always said that the statue of Robert Burns on the campus of Washington University is the finest piece of statuary in St. Louis. So if you don't know it, it's not a huge statue, but it's worth going to find it. It's a very, very beautiful statue.
It's actually close to the intersection. You can see it from the street at Skinker and Forsyth. St. Margaret's, as we mentioned, was the main Catholic church for the Shaw neighborhood, which is named after Henry Shaw, the founder of the Missouri Botanical Garden and Tower Grove Park. So it's on 2 sides. It's bounded by Shaw's own property, and then Shaw Avenue is on the north side. And the Parkway, Flora Place, was originally designed as a driveway to the main entrance of the Botanical Garden through the fields that are now the Shaw neighborhood.
And before we listen to these 2 pieces, the first by Morton Lauridsen, and the second an arrangement of a song by Robert Burns, appropriately enough, for St. Margaret of Scotland, by Donald Cashmore. I think many of you will know the poem, "My love is like a red, red rose." As one of the things we're talking about today is about acoustics, I will just mention a little story so that it's there for perpetuity. And that is that the recording we made at St. Margaret of Scotland, which I mentioned before is called Songs of the Soul, took advantage of the very warm, resonant acoustic that that church has, particularly because I think quite a lot of marble on the reflective surfaces there as well. But as we got there, we had a producer flown in from Great Britain, we had the engineers, everything ready. We had what you can sometimes hear in our venue here, we had a hum, an electrical hum. And of course, choral music is notoriously finicky and desperately susceptible to extraneous noises. You have to have the room completely silent before you can make a take. And we had this constant hum, and of course the producer from England was going crazy, saying, what on earth is going on here? We can't possibly make a recording with this. And we eventually isolated the hum to an improvement by Amarin UE of an electric box in the vestry that they had put in just a few months beforehand. And they had obviously wired some of the box too closely. And so you were getting this induced hum in the whole building from the loudspeakers. Even if they were off, you were getting this noise. So we didn't know what to do because we needed electricity. So this is the backstory behind recordings for you all. Someone in our group went to Home Depot and bought 50 yards, maybe, if not more, that of a heavy electrical cable. Other people went out and bought some arc lights, some huge lights on stands, and we got wiring it, and thanks to various people in the choir and various board members, we set up the whole church to have illumination and power for the recording, but powered from an outlet in the priest's house next door to the church. So every time I listen to that recording, I remember the pain. And the other thing I'll say is that this other thing is that that neighborhood has some lovely houses around, people very house proud. And wouldn't you know it, right in the middle of that recording session, one gentleman decided that it was time to mow his lawn again. And by this time, the British producer was just, you know, he was nearly frazzled to have, also we had a tornado alert. Oh. And we don't have tornadoes in England. So he was regretting very much the fact that he'd come to make this recording. But he looked at me and he just said, "You have to get that man to stop." And I said, I don't know how to stop. So a board member, full of resources and $20 bills, went out and he just basically said to this gentleman, "How much will it cost for you to do your lawn mowing at another time?" And the answer is $100.
Oh,
Outrageous.
I thought we got away with it, actually. So anyway, enjoy these two recordings, very different pieces in St. Ambrose, music by Lauridsen, and in St. Margaret of Scotland, music arranged by Donald Cashmore.
We're going to look at two more churches on the south side of the city, and one other, and Philip has called them the cathedrals of the south side because they're so large. Partly this was because the Catholic churches were widely spaced, but also it was partly because of rivalry and pride of the various parishes. And it was so true that in the case of St. Francis de Sales, a postcard company printed a postcard for them and labeled it Cathedral of St. Louis because they were so impressed with the picture. St. Anthony of Padua was built in 1908 by a Franciscan architect who actually traveled from one Franciscan foundation to another. And it, of course, it dominates the skyline because it's on the ridge that is followed by Merrimack Avenue. And Merrimack marks the boundary between the St. Louis Commons to the north and the Carondelet Commons to the south. Carondelet was an independent city from St. Louis until 1870, founded in the 1760s, just 3 years after St. Louis. The church has most spectacular and early windows by Emil Frey, who had come to this city from Munich just a year or two before that project, and the detailing and realism of the windows is still outstanding. It's also a church that we can be very fortunate to still have because it was struck by lightning in 1994 and a major fire took place, actually very similar to the fire at Notre Dame Cathedral, because it was kept from going into the main body of the church by the vaulted ceiling. And fortunately, a year after the fire, they were able to reopen it. Our Lady of Sorrows was founded in a community called Gardenville, but it also had a lot of cemeteries, and that is thought to be the reason for the name Sorrows. It was built in 1927 by Adolf Stauder in the early Christian style of churches that you see in Rome and Ravenna, Italy. And it's really the only example of that style in the St. Louis area, and it's a very fine one, very large, with beautiful columns.
Let me just interrupt you just for one thing about that church,
Yeah.
because you say it's really the only example. Mm-hmm. If you're wondering what on earth's different about it, its ceiling is flat. It's what we call like a coffered ceiling, I think, with recesses in it, but it's flat. So you're so used to ceilings in these sort of Gothic churches being like the upturned ship, you know, a nave, but it's very, very different, and that definitely has an effect upon the acoustic, just as it does in its precursor in Rome, with Santa Maria Maggiore, which is where Palestrina wrote so much of his music. And we believe that one of the reasons that Palestrina's polyphony works so well, intricate polyphony, voice parts coming in at different times, different rhythms overlapping, but it all works, you can hear everything, because even though the building itself is very large, the coffered ceiling sort of breaks the acoustic somewhat and stops it being overly reverberant. And that is definitely true at Our Lady of Sorrows, and that definitely informs my choice of literature whenever we get the chance to sing there. Sorry.
Oh, very interesting, yeah. St. Francis de Sales, from an acoustical point of view, is closer to the new cathedral, with extremely reverberant. And again, I think it's because of the hard surfaces. This was a German parish church, surprisingly named for a French saint. It was under construction in 1896 when the tornado came through. It destroyed everything above the basement. So it wasn't finished then until 12 years later, and they had to switch from stone to brick. But they kept the 300-foot-high spire, which was something that the congregation had insisted on. That's still the tallest church spire in the St. Louis area, and there are only a few churches in the whole United States that have spires that are higher than 300 feet. It also has spectacular windows of German saints and great wood carving.
And so in that warm, deeply resonant acoustic, we're going to hear a Welsh composer, Paul Mealers, Ubi caritas et amor, where love and charity are, there I am also. That was an arrangement he made of one of his own pieces, Now Sleeps the Crimson Petal, for the wedding of William and Kate at Westminster Abbey. And before that, again, a piece of polyphony that in a way shouldn't work so well in a hugely resonant building, but because of that roof, that ceiling in Our Lady of Sorrows, it does work very well. This is from the Netherlands, Jan Petersen Svelinck's Hodie Christus Natus Est, from the Renaissance. Today Christ has been born. But we'll begin with a very different piece of music at St Anthony of Padua. The repertoire that I chose for that particular concert was all music that had featured in movies. And as you probably know, choral music, tremendously atmospheric, can immediately convey a mood to the viewer of a movie. Choral music features prominently in the cinema. And so what we're going to hear is a piece by one of the great composers of Hollywood music, the Hungarian emigre Miklos Rozsa. And this is his music for I think the original version of Jungle Book, not the Disney one. This is by, I think, Alexander Korda. And so you hear a lullaby from Jungle Book. So music by Rozsa, then Svelink, and finally Paul Miller. Well, as St. Louis expanded in the 20th century and certainly moved further and further westwards, we get new suburbs and the incorporation of formerly independent little towns into the greater St. Louis conurbation, we might call it. And architecture is always a reflection of the society that it serves. And so you see, as St. Louis expanded further west in the 20th century, you get a different style of building of places of public worship. So we, earlier on in this presentation, took a little tour in Grand Center of 3 buildings that were cheek by jowl. There was this church, the Baptist, there was the Sheldon Concert Hall, and then Powell Symphony Hall. Well, if we went further west and into the suburbs, we'd get another place where there are these different buildings that are really right opposite one another, just about. And our next set of pieces comes from what I call new builds. And they're not just because they were built after these other structures, but they have a new concept, if you will, a new vision for how these buildings should look. So obviously, I go over to Esley. Tell us about these 2 buildings.
Yeah, we used to think that these buildings were just not very distinguished, but now I think many people, especially younger people, recognize that the mid-century era of the 20th century is one of the great eras of architecture in St. Louis. And surprisingly, the churches were some of the most far-seeing clients that the architects worked with at that time. That's definitely true of these 2 buildings. The Ethical Society on Clayton Road in Ladue was moved out there in 1964 from this area, and they hired the leading modern architect of St. Louis at that time, Harris Armstrong. They gave him a very difficult challenge because the site is many feet below the level of the street, which is not the most imposing location. But he was able to design that soaring roof that now is one of the landmarks of St. Louis. And on the inside, it's an interesting space because the worship space, or really meeting space, is a rectangle with no windows. It's completely lined with wooden paneling. All the light comes from above. And the color comes from the lobby windows, which are sheets of different colored glass in a kind of an unusual palette that is repeated in the seats of the sanctuary. Second Baptist Church was designed by one of the other leading architects of that time, Frederick Dunn, whose work went back to St. Mark's Church in St. Louis Hills in 1938, which was considered to be the first modern church in this region, and quite shocking. But this church is much more so. It has very little presence from the street now because it was originally intended to be part of a cloister design with other buildings and a tower around it. Similar to the building that the Second Baptist Church was leaving on Kings Highway in the Holy Corners area, in arrangement anyway. But they never had the money to do that. But the interior of the church remains especially beautiful to me because it has that coral colored brick, which was such a characteristic of this era of American architecture. And it has windows that are unique in that they are not stained glass, but enameled glass, designed to represent the Beatitudes by Siegfried Reinhardt, who was a local artist who was nationally renowned.
So these 2 very different buildings, of course, have their own distinct acoustics. And the Ethical Society is a favorite of the St. Louis Classical Guitar Society. They think it's one of the best places to hear classical guitar because it's intimate, wonderful sight lines, no pillars in your way, but also the materials, the wooden paneling, gives just that amount of resonance to an instrument, which of course is wood. So it's perfect for guitar. And with the right repertoire, it's very good for choirs. We like with their earlier version, now the Sheldon, which was the Ethical Society, this building is also perhaps a little too small for our full choir. So if we go there as the full choir, we have to think very, very carefully about the sort of music we sing. But I've chosen for you to hear a piece that's sung just by the women's voices, because for that sort of half a choir for us, it's ideal. So you're going to hear two movements from Virgil Thomson's setting of County Cullen's translation of Euripides' Medea. Really very, very unusual music. And again, I often like to say, if we don't do this music, who else will? It's not religious music. It's not overtly sort of sentimental. It's not a program of folk songs or something like that. But it's very, very affecting and telling music. Compare that then with the acoustic at Second Baptist. Now, again, that is not overly resonant, but there's a very clean acoustic there. And I'd like to bring up here a point about the acoustic, not just for the audience, but for the singers themselves. So often you get a building that sounds wonderful, but the singers complain that they can't hear one another. And you can appreciate with an unaccompanied choir, that's a big challenge, because you're often waiting for a cue from somebody else. And if you can't quite hear them because the acoustic is muddying the sound or even obscuring the sound, then that's a real challenge. Second Baptist does not have that problem. It has a very clean acoustic. We made our Spanish Christmas CD there, and it was interesting that I was able to choose Renaissance music to be performed in this very modern building. I mean, it was because every part, singing in imitation of one another, was clearly able to detect and hear the other parts doing those lines before it was their turn to take them on. So, two very different acoustics. First, the Ethical Society music by Virgil Thomson, a Missouri composer, of course, although he made most of his life in New York City, but born in Kansas City, Missouri. And after that, a piece by the Canadian woman composer Eleanor Daly, which sets a very famous poem about World War I in Flanders Fields.
we're going to look at 3 other county churches right now. In each case, they're old congregations in new buildings. I mentioned it's kind of like old wine in new bottles. First Presbyterian Church was founded just a year after the founding of Kirkwood, which was associated with the founding of the Missouri Pacific Railroad, which went through there in 1853. And in 1854, they gave land for First Presbyterian Church. This is currently the 3rd building on that same site, built in the 1950s by Will Campbell and Robert Fisher, who were members of the congregation. Fisher went on to have a distinguished career both here and in California, with a lot of other churches. The interior is extremely large for a suburban church in particular, and it's almost unique among Protestant churches in the St. Louis area in having a very large iconographic program worked out in their stained glass windows, which represent the Old Testament and New Testament writers of the Bible. And the windows are floor to ceiling, designed by Jacoby Studios, which was another local firm here. Recently, the chancel there has been remodeled to accommodate musical groups, and the Metropolitan Orchestra of St. Louis has now made that their permanent home, if we ever end our COVID shutdown. St. Paul's Lutheran Church in De Pere was virtually the only Lutheran or evangelical church, German-based church, in the central part of the West County for many years. Founded in 1846, and they have gone through several buildings also. Their 1938 building was designed by Theodore Steinmeier with an extension at right angles to the earlier church, designed almost 50 years later by Rex Becker. This is somewhat ironic in that both Steinmeier and Becker specialized in Lutheran churches, and they were rivals in their profession. And Temple Israel in Creve Coeur was founded in 1887, and it still has the Roman temple building that they built in 1905 in the Holy Corners neighborhood at Kings Highway and Washington Avenues. They planned to move into the county in 1957, but they were delayed by the city of Creve Coeur, and eventually the case went to the Missouri Supreme Court, and they weren't able to complete the building until 1963. So it's not only an architectural landmark, but it's actually a civil rights landmark in Missouri. It was designed by Gio Obata, the chief designer for Helmuth Obata and Kassebaum, now HOK. And it is another building that has no windows in the sanctuary part except for the ceiling, which has a series of skylights that are divided into interlocking Jewish stars, or shields of David is another name for them. It also, at the interior, is notable for a very large sculpture designed for the platform by Rodney Winfield, a local sculptor and artist.
So the music you're going to hear in these 3 very different buildings, first of all, I'm going to go from back to front. So Temple Israel, we chose this as a place to perform a concert back, I think, 1998, to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the State of Israel. Mm-hmm. So it seemed appropriate, and for that we performed what is essentially the national anthem, which is the Hatikva, arranged by Reuven Kosakov. And before that, you'll hear a piece of Brahms. Now, every season by the Chamber Chorus has pieces of music by Brahms and Mendelssohn because they are central to choral music, really. This piece of Brahms is a very interesting piece. It was commissioned for the unveiling of the funeral monument to his great teacher and friend, Robert Schumann. It was actually not performed at the opening because they decided to go with, I think, a brass ensemble instead. But so this piece was not published until after Brahms's death. But it is a very beautiful piece that talks about a memorial to the living. But we'll begin with a piece that is a memorial to the recently departed. In First Presbyterian of Kirkwood, we performed the Requiem by the British composer Herbert Howells, that he wrote in the 30s upon the death of his only son, a child, Michael Kendrick Howells. This deeply affected him. It would affect any parent, of course, but it deeply affected Howells to the degree that he composed this Requiem as a private offering, really, to his son. And then he put that away in a drawer, and he wouldn't let anybody see it for decades. And it was actually only towards the very end of his death in the early 80s, I believe, or was it the 70s? He died in 83, but in the 70s, that he was prevailed upon to release this piece. It actually formed the kernel of a large-scale orchestral work that he did release, and for many it's one of the greatest pieces of English music, not just choral music, that's ever been written, called Hymnus Paradisi. So from this setting, we hear just one movement, which is, I heard a voice from heaven saying, write. So music, first of all, by Howells, then Brahms, and then Kossakov. Well, we've reached the end of our odyssey around St. Louis City and County, and all the different venues. We've visited about a third, actually, of the ones we've performed in over 65 years. So I know it's been a long afternoon, but I hope you've enjoyed this great survey of styles and buildings, and learned a little about how we choose the settings that we perform in. I think sometimes people ask me, what's your favorite acoustic? And to me, it's a little like saying, well, which is your favorite child? St. Louis is so richly endowed with history and wonderful buildings and wonderful traditions, and we are equally richly served by the expertise and insights of you, Esley. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
It's really been a great privilege. Thank you. But if I had to have a favorite child, I'll say that a building that we always love performing in, for everything from the warm welcome that the community gives us when we go there, to just the experience of singing in the space. Visually and acoustically, it's really what I like to call a marriage, if you will, a marriage of architecture and music. Somebody once said that architecture is frozen music, and to me, this church embodies that. What I'd like us to finish with is the conclusion to a remarkable recent setting of the Catholic Mass by the Latvian composer Ugis Prauliņš, a really remarkable composer. I'm very thrilled to say that he has written for us in the past. We've sung some of his music. He's a really gifted and imaginative writer. And you can see this imagination coming forth in this last movement of the Mass, the Agnus Dei, because Ugis, in addition to being a classical composer, is a rock musician. And so he is very familiar with the use of microphones and electronics, and he has incorporated the idea of amplification into this setting for unaccompanied voices, I think, to the most wonderful effect. At the end, it's not necessarily the voice of God you hear, because it's somebody actually praying to God, but it does have a sort of otherworldly feel to it. And it was so wonderful that in the occasion we performed it, one of our members is a Catholic priest, and so I was able to ask Father Brian to take on this role and basically to bless everybody there and to give this prayer for everybody there at the conclusion of the Missa Regensis. But before we do that, Esley, just let's finish with your last comments on this building and what makes it not just a wonderful place to sing in, but to visit.
Well, I agree about the importance of this. We're talking about the St. Louis Abbey, which was originally built as the priory chapel, but now it's been raised in status to an abbey. And it's also a parish church called St. Anselm in Creve Coeur. It was one of the major works by Gio Obata, and I think many lovers of mid-century architecture would say that it ranks second only to the Arch as the most important building in St. Louis from that era. It's partly, as we've discussed earlier, the fact that you have this enormous, unbroken expanse of space when you walk inside with no divisions or anything holding up the roof, except the walls, which are thin shell concrete arranged in 2 tiers of parabolic arches and topped by a very tall lantern over the central oculus or open light. So the light seems to be coming from all directions, and it's a very even light because the windows are covered with a fabric that's called a fiberglass polyester, which gives a uniform light through the whole building. Whether it's sunny or rainy on the outside, you have that sense of calm created by that lighting effect.
A sense of calm, definitely. That's what, and for performers, of course, that's a great gift because we're already nervous when we enter a building to see if we can get it right. And this building seems to work its magic on us and then from that on our audiences. So with that, I thank you very much for being with us for this presentation about architecture, traditions, and music. I hope you've learned something about how the choir works, and I can't wait to get back into these spaces to make them ring once again, and I'm sure that you'll be with us when that happy day occurs. But for now, we hear the Agnus Dei from the Mass for the city of Riga by Ugis Praulinch.
Amen.